Today, the traveler on the Nile enters a wonderland at whose gates rise the colossal pyramids of which he has had visions, perhaps from earliest childhood. So said the great American archaeologist, Egyptologist, and historian, Dr. James Henry Breasted. Egypt is the land of pyramids, great and small. What child isn't fascinated by their towering majesty? They dot the landscape of Egypt and number, by most recent count, well over 100. For over 1,000 years, the pyramid was the dominant form of royal burial in Egypt. Why did the Egyptians build pyramids? For this, we need to delve into ancient Egyptian religious myths of creation. In one myth, a mound of earth rose out of the primeval waters. At the top of the mound, a lily bloomed as the first life form. The sun rose from its petals to bring life to the newly created world. This mound took the concrete form of a pyramided stone. The Egyptians called it Ben-Ben, a name derived from the root word ben that means to rise up. Also derived from this root word is the word Weben, which means the rising of the sun. So, from the very beginning, the pyramid shape represented new life emerging from a mound of earth, bringing the sunrise's light and warmth. The mound of creation was also the very power of life itself. So it's not surprising that the ancient Egyptians translated the mound into a pyramid for royal burials. The pyramid embodied and symbolized creation and resurrection. Kings gave their royal pyramids names like the horizon of Khufu or Sneferu is rising, phrases that evoked the sun's ascension. The pyramid acted as a resurrection machine for the king. Now, the pyramid burial didn't appear overnight. It gradually developed. The earliest kings sunk their tombs into the desert of Abydos. Now, Abydos was the cult center of ancient Egypt's primary funerary god, Osiris. These tombs had interior rooms lined with mud brick to hold the king's body, a wooden shrine, and grave goods. The burial was crowned by a mound-shaped tumulus that symbolized the primeval mound of resurrection and protected the tomb below from erosion. The funerary enclosure in which the king's cult was celebrated was built closer to the cultivation. In the Second Dynasty, kings moved their burials to Saqqara, the necropolis near the Egyptian capital of Memphis. These tombs had multiple corridors cut into the rock. No superstructure remained, although Egyptologists assume the burials were topped with mud brick or stone mastabas. Mastaba means bench in Arabic, with sloping sides and a flat top. King Zoshar took it one step further. He laid one mastaba on top of the other and integrated the king's funerary enclosure in one large structure. The result was the first step stone pyramid. Fill in the steps, and you have a true pyramid. I'll discuss these steps in depth when we look at the pyramid complexes of kings Zoshar and Sneferu. Then comes the inevitable question, how were the pyramids built? Believe it or not, there is really no simple answer to this question. So let's start with the basics. What do you need to create a pyramid? First, you need a site with a broad bedrock foundation on which to build, something pyramid builders learned by trial and error. You also need a source of stone to quarry nearby. You need high-ranking officials to oversee pyramid construction, people like architects, priests, and scribes with administrative and building experience. And you need laborers to work year-round. Young Egyptian men probably registered in their villages to be drafted into the Royal Pyramid Project. Imagine the amazement of a teenager from a small agricultural hamlet. He arrives at the building site and sees thousands of men cutting and hauling stone. And then he views, for the very first time, a massive pyramid rising in the background. It must have looked like a Cecil B. DeMille production. Laborers on royal pyramid projects were not slaves. Huge public work projects like the pyramid building provided room and board for workers. Workers slept in dormitories on long platforms. They ate well. A study of animal bones in the Giza workmen's village showed workmen devoured large quantities of meat, fowl, and fish. Huge bakeries made bread. Workers drank bone broth and enormous amounts of beer. They received proper medical attention. Skeletal remains show broken bones were set and healed correctly. Less encouraging was the presence of spinal stress consistent with hard labor. Pyramid towns were populated by craftsmen, farmers, butchers, physicians, and guards. Priests, both men and women, served the community. Scribes administered the day-to-day movement of people and goods. Princes and high-ranking officials governed the towns and lived in large villas nearby. Upon arrival, Egyptologists assume laborers were placed in divisions of 2,000 workers. Each division was split into 2 groups of 1,000, composed of 5 gangs of 200 workers. Each gang was further divided into 5 files of 40 workers. At the Giza pyramids, files had names like Friends of King Khufu. One of my favorites was called the Drunkards of King Menkaure. Workers rotated in and out of many gangs during their draft period. How much time they served in total, we simply don't know. How many laborers did it take to build a pyramid? Let's take the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza. Most Egyptologists believe Khufu's pyramid took 23 to 27 years to build. That means 340 limestone blocks needed to be quarried every day, and every hour, 34 blocks had to be delivered. According to calculations, an entire division of 2,000 workers quarried and transported stone blocks. A further 1,000 men set the blocks in courses. There were also support people like craftsmen to make and repair copper tools, quarrymen, kitchen, and storeroom staff, etc. All told, as many as 20,000 people contributed to the work on the Great Pyramid. Not only was the Great Pyramid a feat of engineering, but it was also an administrative accomplishment. Now, to build a pyramid, you need tools for stone cutting, pounding, cleaving, drilling, sawing, trimming, and polishing. During the Great Pyramid Age, workers used dolerite hammerstones and copper chisels with wooden hammers to cut the limestone. If you look carefully, you can still find dolerite balls around the bases of some pyramids. To cut harder stones like granite, the builders used a wet slurry of quartz sand and metal saws. All of these methods were incredibly labor-intensive and time-consuming, yet the ancient Egyptians excelled in working with stone. After the Old Kingdom, they used bronze tools, which were harder than copper. Highly skilled pyramid builders used techniques like measuring and setting points. Many pyramids are oriented to the cardinal points east, west, north, and south. Ancient texts call the circumpolar stars the imperishable ones because they neither rise nor set as they circle the celestial North Pole at 23 degrees. Ancient Egyptian religion believed the king's eternal destiny was to join these stars upon death. The east was the place of the rising sun and eternal resurrection. How did the architects orient the pyramid to the cardinal points? There are many ideas that include measuring the rising and setting points of certain circumpolar stars or the North Star. The simplest and easiest method was proposed by engineer Glenn Dash, an MIT-trained engineer and archaeologist who studied the pyramids. It involves plotting the sun's path through the day, using the shadow it casts from a rod or pole stuck vertically into the ground. As the sun moves through the sky, the shadow shifts across the floor like the point on a sundial. If you plot the shadow's position on the ground every half an hour, you're left with a curved shadow line. With a curved shadow line drawn, you wrap a short, taut piece of string around the vertical pole and move it around the pole in a circle. The end of the string should intercept 2 points on the shadow line. Drawing a new line through these 2 points creates a line running east and west. To find the true north, simply bisect the east-west line. Now, if you do this on the day of the autumn equinox, it's possible to create a perfectly straight shadow line that runs precisely east-west, with no need for the second string line. Why the equinox? The day is halfway between the summer and the winter solstices, so day and night are of equal length, meaning the sun is perfectly centered in the sky. So let's say this is what the Egyptian architects did. Now the lines would need to be extended outwards more than 755 feet, roughly the size of 2.5 football fields. The slightest inaccuracy would increase the angle of error. Then they would measure one side of the pyramid base and turn a right angle to make the corners. Finally, they would measure the perpendicular sides to the opposite corners and turn another set of right angles. The surveyors probably did this by sight because any errors would be averaged out. Once the measuring of the base was finalized, workers cut small holes into the rock for a cord run through the stakes. If you look close enough around the base of Khufu or Khafre's pyramid, you might well see the small holes for posts that carried the cord, spaced less than around 2 inches apart. Then the base of the pyramid needed to be leveled. The ancient Egyptians used a level square, a right-angled isosceles triangle made from wood. This tool was in the shape of the letter A and looked like a triangle ruler or a builder's square. A plumb line was suspended from the top of the A. When the plumb bob coincided with a mark in the middle of the crossbeam, the surface area on which the two legs stood was level. To establish an equal level over a large surface, the triangle was laid on top of a horizontal beam and calibrated. By fixing upon a leveling staff in the distance, differences in height could be noted and corrected. Actual field tests show it would correctly level distances up to 90 meters. Builders used the same method to level the platform of the pyramid. By placing the 2 feet of the A-frame on the surface, the plumb registered any deviation from horizontal. The stone was carved and measured again until the plumb bob was centered on the crossbar. The square level allowed the architects to keep the pyramid courses perfectly horizontal. Some archaeologists think that the Egyptians dug a grid of channels that covered the pyramid's base area and then filled them with water. Once the water's surface was marked on the trench's sides, the water was drained and the channels were cut to a standard depth. Now, most Egyptologists today believe this leveling method was not used, mainly because the water would evaporate during the long trek from the Nile to the pyramid building site in the hot desert. Now is time to build the pyramid. Pyramids of the Third Dynasty were constructed in vertical layers that were inclined inwards. In the early Fourth Dynasty, pyramids rose in horizontal layers with shaped casing stones. Later pyramids had rough stone cores filled out by backing stones covered with casing. And Middle Kingdom pyramids had mud brick cores with a fine limestone casing. Old Kingdom pyramids were built with different types of stones. Core stones placed horizontally in tiers or steps that got smaller towards the top, backing stones of many sizes that fill out the space between the core stones and the casing stones, and large, fine white limestone casing that creates a true pyramid. The core stones were so irregular that the builders used significant quantities of gypsum mortar to set them. If you look at the holes or any damage to a pyramid, you get a window into the structure's guts and see these 3 types of stones. How did the ancient Egyptians haul stones, some as heavy as 2 tons, from the quarry to the pyramid site? They did this by using tracks of wooden planks arranged to form rails sunk into a bed of limestone chips and desert clay or plaster. A large stone could be tumbled by a rope lasso into a wooden sled with rounded skids at the front. 10 or 12 men could easily pull a 2-ton block on a sled up an inclined ramp equipped with partially sunken wooden planks. Water was poured under the sled at the front to reduce the friction. The form of inclined pyramid delivery ramps is one of the most hotly debated questions today among Egyptologists, architects, and engineers. Because only a few small pyramids have remains of ramps, many theories abound. So let's take a look at the current theories. First is the single straight-on ramp. This ramp would need to be lengthened each time the pyramid rose to maintain a gradual slope of 1 unit of rise per 10 units of length. A slope of 8 degrees would make it impossible for workers to drag the stones up the ramps. The problem with the straight-on ramp theory is that work would stop when the ramp needed to be lengthened. At the top of the pyramid, the ramp would be over a mile long and cover the quarry that provided the pyramid blocks. The sheer volume of stone needed for this ramp would also exceed the volume of stones needed to build the pyramid itself. For these reasons, the single straight-on ramp theory is not generally accepted. Another theory suggests a ramp that zigzagged across one face of the pyramid. The problem here is that the ramp would be too narrow to allow for 2 groups to use the ramp simultaneously, one going up and the other going down. Also, maneuvering large blocks around a 90-degree corner would require levering, which is a really slow process. The wraparound ramp theory proposes a spiral ramp around the structure of the pyramid. One long stone ramp accessed the quarry and rose along one side of the pyramid. 2/3 of the way up, the ramp spiraled around to the top. However, the wraparound ramp would obscure large parts of the structure so that an accurate measurement of the pyramid's edges could not be taken. The zigzag ramp only goes up on one side, so it'd be easier to take measurements. The multi-delivery ramp theory is dependent on the idea that the core of each pyramid was stepped. Blocks could be delivered by a series of short ramps until the pyramid rose high enough to create additional ramps on the higher side, and so on. With this method, a stone block would follow a complicated course with lots of twists and turns and 90-degree angles. The latest theory, limited to the Great Pyramid, proposes an internal ramp that spiraled up and around like a parking garage in the inside of the core step pyramid. At the beginning of construction, a single external ramp was used to set the largest granite blocks for the king's chamber. Once a third of the work was completed, the ramp was replaced by an internal structure that wrapped around the pyramid at a slope of 7 degrees. Openings were left at the corners to allow enough room to turn the blocks around the corners. Now, the Scan Pyramids mission used muons to scan the Great Pyramid. Muons are byproducts of the cosmic rays that form in the Earth's upper atmosphere and can actually penetrate stone. The muon scan did not show the presence of any internal ramps within the Great Pyramid. There are problems with all of these theories. Turning a 2.5-ton stone around a 90-degree corner of a pyramid is one, and it's not easy. Mark Lehner suggests that workers could easily turn a block by tying a rope around it and placing a smooth rock underneath the stone as a fulcrum. As you walk it across, you stick another fulcrum stone under the other end, and you walk it further. It only takes twice the width of the block to turn it, and 1/10 of the weight of the block. This makes 90-degree turns of a 2.5-ton block on a spiral ramp a lot easier to do. Another problem is that space was too limited for the ramps at the very top of the pyramid. So how was the pyramidion, or the capstone of the pyramid, placed? In this case, we look at Herodotus, who wrote that blocks at the top were lifted with wooden levers. Levering could be used for side movements, final adjustments, and to place the blocks on uppermost courses. Egyptologists, of course, continue to debate this as well. So the search for answers about the type of pyramid delivery ramp continues. Now, I've covered how the core stones were delivered and placed. But how is the fine white limestone outer casing beveled and placed to create a true smooth-side pyramid? In 2013, French Egyptologist Pierre Tallet made an exciting discovery at the Red Sea port of Wadi Jarf. He found a number of papyri, one of which belonged to an inspector named Merer. Merer detailed the day-by-day movements of his file that delivered stones from the eastern quarry of Tura to the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Merer's journal noted that fine white Tura limestone was ferried to Giza by means of wooden barges that sailed through a series of canals. Egyptologist Mark Lehner suggests the builders used a water transport infrastructure that took advantage of the Nile flood. Now, from August to October, at this time, the Nile rose 23 feet. Pyramids built on high plateaus took advantage of the flood as a hydraulic lift for 15 to 17-ton blocks. Once offloaded, the casing stones were hauled on wooden sleds to the pyramid. The casing stones at the base of the Great Pyramid of Khufu display one of the most remarkable feats of stone carving in the world. Khufu's stonemasons fitted together 7 to 15-ton blocks of stone with joints so fine that not even a razor blade can slip between them. How did the Egyptians achieve this amazing feat? When the builders began the pyramid's foundation pavement and the bottom course of the casing, they set the cornerstones and several center stones on each face to establish the line. In the quarry, stonecutters dressed only the bottom of the stone to fit precisely with the rock below it. The stone was then hauled to its intended place on the pyramid. Once placed, the side joint faces of the stone were dressed so they fit the neighboring stone. The slope was marked on the joint face and moved to lie flush with its neighbor's stone. Now the upper face was labeled. Part of the stone was still overhanging the stone course beneath. Where the two neighboring stones touched each other, extra stock on the front of the block was beveled away from the slope line. The unfinished stock was left like this to help anchor the stone delivery ramps that rose with the pyramid. Once the pyramidion was placed, the masons dressed the extra stock on the front of the block, working from the top of the pyramid down as they removed the delivery ramps. They chipped away the excess stone on the pyramid face so that the spaces between each block would gradually close. When the join was so small a knife blade could not slip between the joins, the masons knew they could not cut any deeper into the stone. They had reached the desired plane of the pyramid face. Last but definitely not least, the builders needed to take into account the pyramid's interior rooms and corridors. Burial chambers in most pyramids were sunk or partly sunk into the bedrock. The early Egyptians believed that the king's rebirth occurred in the earth's depths. But by the 4th dynasty, the deep underground funerary chambers were abandoned. Now they were placed higher, sometimes at ground level, and oriented east-west. By the time of Khufu, the chambers sat higher up in the pyramid, so builders left openings as the pyramid rose course by course. The royal burial chamber was oriented east-west, and the ascending corridor that met it ran north-south. These orientations symbolize two views of the pharaoh's afterlife. The east-to-west orientation related to the sun cult and the king's place in it. The pharaoh was the earthly manifestation of the sun god, literally the son of Ra. In death, the king would join the east-west course of the sun and be eternally renewed. Now, pyramid corridors inside ran north to south. From the burial chamber, the passage ascended to open on the northern face of the pyramid. It was believed upon death, the pharaoh's soul would join with the circumpolar stars of the northern sky. As I mentioned earlier, these stars were known by the ancient Egyptians as the imperishable ones because they never sank into the horizon. A number of structures accompanied the pyramid, all dedicated to the eternal cult of the king. A mortuary temple abutted the pyramid with a causeway connecting it to the valley temple and the port below. A satellite pyramid sat on the south of the main pyramid, along other subsidiary pyramids for the king's family, all enclosed by a wall. The causeway ran from below, from the land of the living in the east to the realm of the dead above in the west. These structures made up the classic pyramid complex. Middle Kingdom pyramids followed Old Kingdom models but were much smaller. Many Middle Kingdom pyramids were constructed with mud brick cores faced with limestone. Dieter Arnold, an ancient Egyptian architecture expert, has estimated that around 5,000 workers could build a mud brick pyramid 246 feet high. This includes roughly 640 mud brick makers and carriers, 80 basket carriers, 250 stone cutters, 1,500 stone transporters, 200 boat sailors, 600 stone lifters, and 1,500 craftsmen, as well as auxiliary workers. The only problem was that once the stone robbers removed the outside limestone casing, the pyramid fell apart. What happened when the pharaoh died? The funeral of the king is never shown in reliefs that decorated his pyramid complex. For this, we need to look at burial scenes from the tombs of the king's official, which kind of give us a general idea. The king in his coffin was carried on a bier. Overcome with sadness, some people fell to the ground, pulled at their clothing, threw dirt on their heads. Weeping and wailing, the widow and professional mourners followed the coffin, along with the embalmer and priests. The coffin was loaded on a barge to voyage from the east bank to the pyramid harbor on the west bank of the Nile. Immediately upon reaching the necropolis, the pharaoh's body was taken to the tent of purification. Here the body was ritually purified and its viscera removed. Then it was taken to the nearby pure place of wrapping, or the mortuary workshop. There it was packed with salts to desiccate it, oiled, and wrapped. The whole process lasted anywhere from 70 to 272 days. Now the pharaoh's body was ready to function on another plane of existence. Oxen pulled the pharaoh's mummified body in its coffin on a sled, accompanied by the funeral entourage. The procession to the pyramid probably included all of the furnishings, food, and drink needed for the afterlife. This is only a guess, because no burial assemblage remains intact from Old Kingdom pyramids. At the pyramid, the priest performed the coming forth at the voice invocation to summon the king to partake of the offerings. This was followed by offering rituals that included water, incense, cloth, and food. The opening of the mouth ritual was likely performed to allow the king to breathe, eat, and speak in the afterlife. Once inside the pyramid passages, the coffin was then slid and dragged towards the burial chamber. It was placed in the large stone sarcophagus, and the lid to the sarcophagus was lowered. The architects of the Great Pyramid conceived of several different barriers to protect the burial of the king. Once the granite sarcophagus received the king's body, workers lowered 3 heavy stones to block access to the burial chamber. Workers then lowered 3 5-ton blocks of granite to seal the lower end of the ascending passage from the descending passage. With only the light from their crude oil lamps, the workmen exited the grand gallery through the service shaft, a 28-foot wide tunnel that descended almost vertically through the guts of the pyramid. The workmen slipped down the tunnel and emerged into the descending passage, only to crawl their way up and out of the pyramid, presumably with a sigh of relief. So much for those scenes in Hollywood movies of all the workers trapped in eternity inside the pyramid. Once the king was buried within the pyramid, the activity did not cease. The mortuary temple served as the deified king's eternal palace. The valley temple was its gateway. Priests performed daily and nightly rituals inside the mortuary temple and on its roof. Priests opened the statue shrines and presented cloth, sacred oil, and recited the sacred formula to the king's statues. Another priest unveiled, cleaned, dressed, and adorned the royal statues. Incense was lit. Priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony before the statues. Then the offering ceremony took place and the ritual meal was consumed. These daily rituals assured that the continuation of the king's life force. Since this life force provided for the living, a cult service to the king was a cult service for everyone. The pyramids continue to captivate us today as living monuments of an ancient civilization. With rudimentary tools and great engineering know-how, the ancient Egyptians built these massive cenotaphs for their kings. This was not idle labor. The ancient Egyptians saw the pyramids as resurrection machines that aided the divine king's eternal union with the sun and the heavens. And in so doing, the king guaranteed the perpetual order of Egypt and the eternal life of those who served him.